Hi everyone. Good morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you are. Bruce, you've got so familiar now that you're saying good morning from, and you're expecting us to know. But that's cool. So who we got on? Jerry's on as normal. Bruce, Frank, Hugh, Hans, Tuin, Pablo, Sang. Who else? We've got Mark on. David's on. Cool. So welcome. Today we're going to go through, I think, quite a lot of images actually, but we're also going to do a couple of tips to start with. So hopefully we've also changed some of the sound settings as well, which should be a little bit brighter or a little bit easier to hear. Hopefully, if it's not and you can't hear me, then you can't ask, or you can't hear me asking to let me know. But hopefully it's all okay. So let's just get started as normal. So Capture One. We're currently using version 20.1.1 or 13.1.1 for this video. That's going to be the same throughout all of the editing that we do today. For those of you that aren't on version 20 at the moment, randomly or not randomly, the version updates that are happening with Capture One have got a discount on at the moment, and so has the Pro upgrade, or sorry, the Pro purchase. I think there's a 25% discount on. So effectively, if you are going to use the time to move up to version 20 away from version 11 or 12 or whatever, now would probably be a good time to do it. So have a look at capture1.com. You can see all of those offers and details if they're on there. But I don't know exactly when they're going to run out, but at the moment there's sort of a 25% off and some other discounts and upgrades too. So have a look. Let's head into Capture One. So right now, we're looking at a standard picture in Capture One. Remember that there is a little bit of a delay in terms of your comments coming through to us here. So it's not me ignoring you. If you've got something that's a question or a comment, put it into the comments box either on YouTube or Facebook and we'll get to it. But there's about a 15-second delay or so before we see it. So it's not being rude. It just takes a little while for us to see. Okay, so let's have a little look at this one. Now, this one actually is a carryover from last week. So this one was sent in by Brian, and I don't know if for those of you that were on last week, you'll have seen the EXIF data on this shot. Includes in it an extender. So what we mean by extender is obviously you have a SLR camera and then a mount, like a lens that goes into the mount. In between the lens and the camera, you can put an extender on. They're normally 1.4 or 2 times. That has the effect of extending the focal length. So if you have a 100mm lens and you put a 2 times extender on, it becomes 200mm. But it also changes the aperture, the effective aperture. So we've got to be a bit careful. So if you're using, for instance, on this case, we've got a, what was it, 4.5 to 5.6. So if it was out at 400mm at 5.6, then effectively when I put a, let's for example, put a 2 times extender on, then I'm actually going to take it effectively to, I think, f11 from memory, at 800mm. Now, that's all fine, but it means that the EXIF data that comes into Capture One is a little bit screwy / enhanced. Now, as it stands, so Brian's question last week was, why when I bring in these files, is my camera lens up here, so profile, coming in as generic instead of the lens, because the lens is clearly listed in here. The reason is because it's also got this extender on there, and Capture One can't quite find a match. The answer to this is it's being looked at. So by being looked at, I had a chat with David Grover this morning and sort of said, you know, this seems a bit wrong because we are missing something here. There's not an extender version in our lens profile. And if I go into the lens profile and find that lens, so it's a Canon 100 to 400, there it is, the IS2. There isn't one that's plus 1.4 or plus 2.0 for an extender. So a lot of other programs do support it with an extender. So I'm going to continue that conversation with David later and see what we can get into Capture One as a request, maybe long term. But in the meantime, Brian, as the user of this and as a Capture One user, make sure you get into Capture One with that support request to say, look, I use a Canon this lens, or it could be any of these lenses in fairness, with an extender, but when I bring it in, it doesn't necessarily match the extender detail on there. So the reason that you want to match it is because the characteristics of that shot will change with the extender. In theory, we could just go for the standard one, so we could just click this and it will put in the profile that's roughly going to match what's right for this picture. But in reality, it hasn't been calibrated with the extender on, so I'd be really careful about it. In the meantime, though, we talked about it last week, there's nothing wrong with the generic profile in here. The generic profile will allow you to do chromatic aberration, and it's actually going to analyze it directly in the scene, just like we do anyway with a lens profile. It will do diffraction correction, maybe not as well as a profiled lens, but it will do it. It's going to struggle a little bit with sharpness fall off and light fall off because it doesn't know the profile. But in general, it's going to get there pretty good. If you'd use the same lens without the extender, it would load in just fine. So it's bear with, watch this space, but please, Brian, specifically, and anyone else that's using an extender, put in the request to capture one. Hopefully they'll pick up and they'll see there's enough people there that say, hey, I need my extender covered in the lens profiles, and hopefully get them in. Okay. So, with that said, let's have a look at this picture from Brian. So I'm going to use the generic profile just for the sake of it for now. I'm going to put on that analyze for chromatic aberration, so it doesn't really matter if we've got a profile in there, because it's just going to analyze this picture. We won't bother with diffraction correction. We're pretty good on that lens. Not much distortion, although, yeah, actually, no, we're good. Sharpness is actually looking pretty good from memory. Yeah, when we zoom into here, it's tack sharp. Lovely. We've got nice focus fall off in the background, so that's pretty cool. And we're not worried about these outer edges. So remember, sharpness fall off only affects the edges of the frame. So it's worrying about when your lens gets soft out towards the edges. This particular lens is pretty sharp all the way through, so I wouldn't worry about it too much. And at 560mm, you're not even at the widest point anyway of the lens. So we're not worried about that. And then light fall off, again, if your lens vignettes, then potentially use light fall off to get rid of that vignetting. If it hasn't vignetted, like in here, if I use light fall off, you're going to get this strange reverse vignette or brightening at the edges, which just looks funny. So if it looks okay on the screen, don't worry about light fall off. If you don't have to counter the vignette, then don't worry about it. We're looking at high contrast lines for any purple fringing. And on here, I can't see any, but if there was any, then we dial that in, of course, just to counter that. Okay, so question from Andrea. How do you set the brightness of your Mac for editing and for printing? Because results are very different from screen to paper. Yes, they are. It's actually a really common question. So to be honest, we could spend about 7 or 8 hours talking about how to calibrate monitors to paper and so on. You've got calibration tools out there, so like Spider and Monkey and so on. The answer is you will never, ever, despite what anyone tells you, you are never going to get an exact match between a rear project or a rear illuminated screen, which is what your screen is, and paper, which is front illuminated. So effectively, paper is bouncing light back at you and the available ambient light in the room, so it's subtractive color, whereas your screen is additive color. So your screen works on red, green, and blue. Adding those colors together, it's going to generate a color profile. Whereas print works, generally speaking, in cyan, magenta, yellow, and black, unless we're talking about print developing. So the color mix is different. But that can be factored in when you're doing calibration. What cannot be factored in is the fact that one is backlit and one is not. So if you look at a piece of paper that's got direct sunlight looking on it or shining on it, it's going to look really bright. If you look at it in the dark, it's going to look really dark. Your screen, if you go outside with it, it's going to look really dark. And if you go inside, it's going to look really bright. So you've got to sort of temper it. And what I do typically, general rules, if you're trying to compare to print, never run your screen at full brightness at 100%. Typically, I always, on a Mac, it's always sort of 2 notches down, so maybe 2 dots, so whatever that is, 80%, 75%, something like that. That does, again, it doesn't necessarily match it 100%, but at least it gets you in the ballpark of what a print will look like under light. And then you've got to consider how the print's going to be seen. So if the print is going to be seen on a wall with loads of gallery lighting flashing against it, then it's going to appear more vivid and more bright. It also depends how it's mounted. If it's faint or face mounted, it's going to look more vivid. The colors are going to look more saturated. If it's behind glass, you're going to have reflection and stuff. So it's a whole big topic. In reality, if you want a screen to match the print output, you're going to need to work with printer profiles. You're going to need to work with a truly calibrated screen, something like ASO or the Mac, the Apple XDR or Pro Display, as it is. All of those options, the calibrated screen options, are great. And for an example, if I switch my screen from Pro Display to the photography setting, it's almost like turning off the lights. And the reason is because it's trying to emulate paper rather than trying to emulate a backlit screen with RGB channels. So we can't really cover it online. But what I would say is if you want something to match print as close as possible, it's never going to be 100%. Get yourself a color calibrated monitor, or at least a minimum calibrate your monitor to the print profile that comes with your printer, and then hopefully you get there. Okay. So yeah, good question, Bruce. So do they correct for any extenders? I haven't found that they have, actually. So when I looked at the profile, so for instance, even if I dialed in a Schneider one, we don't have, you have it here. So the 150, but with the tele extender, and the 240 with it. But for all the other ones, like the 55 and the 80, we don't have any extension options in there. So it is there, but only in certain cases. So that's part of the conversation that we probably need to have as a group. Okay, so on this one, we don't have any purple fringing. So let's zoom out of there completely. And we're going to go into our base characteristics. So we don't normally start here. Normally, we start over on the exposure tab. And the exposure tab, we kind of want to get to the finishing touches, as it were, once we've got our image set. And by the image set, what I mean is that curve or the profile that came out of the camera. So typically, phase one or capture one will have curve set to auto. So the auto curve is designed to give you quite a vibrant, quite a rich, quite a contrasty image. But you've also got all these other ones in there as standard. So you've got film extra shadow, film high contrast, film standard, and linear response. The one you'll hear about a lot is the one that's called linear response. And if I move my mouse over there, you can see the effect that's had. Everything looks a bit dimmer. Now, it hasn't actually lost any detail. It's not made everything dim and back in the shadows. But if you look at the histogram at the top of the screen up here, this is auto. So this is Capture One taking the picture in and saying, right, how do we automatically tweak this to be vibrant and rich and high contrast, as high contrast as possible without losing detail? And that's what the auto curve will do. But in this case, if you look out here, this is all quite overexposed, and not necessarily overexposed, but we're losing detail in some of this stuff. It seems that way. It seems overly bright. So if ever you're in that situation, or you've got, for instance, a sky, and we'll have a look at one later, if I switch this curve, and it's on this base characteristics profile, which is under here, which is your color tab, change that curve to say linear response, and you see the difference in all of the detail that comes back. Now, the image is going to look darker, but what this effectively means is when I go into my exposure tab, I can now make changes to that curve, as Capture One has done itself for auto, but under more of my own control rather than starting from Capture One. Because if I started from this auto curve, let's just have a look, what I'm probably going to do to begin with is pull down our highlights and our whites to get this detail back. Well, then I may as well have started off on a nice flattened curve, so the linear response curve, and have more control over all of the tones in the image. So the base characteristics thing, we often gloss over it because we simply go from lens correction here and across into the histogram on the exposure tab here. But this here, this curve, can be really valuable if you've got a shot which has very high skews towards the brighter end of the histogram. This allows you to bring a lot of that detail back. Okay, so let's start with our linear response. We've got all that detail, great. So now I'm in control of the entire histogram. I don't have to correct anything to start with. And this is probably more like what the camera actually saw in raw terms, because it hasn't had any tweaking done by Capture One in terms of that auto curve. So with this, first thing we're going to do is we're going to lose this right-hand side. So I'm going to go into our crop tool, make sure we're set to original to keep the same aspect ratio. And we're going to pull down from that right-hand corner. And let's just have a look where we want the ducks to sit. Do we want them to sit in the middle, or do we want them to sit on the bottom? Probably on the bottom a little bit. So I'm just going to bring that in just a touch. And we're going to just move this around. So this grid that comes up when I do the crop, if ever you're wondering where that comes from, that's actually come from this tab, your lens tab. And in here, you've got your grid, which is set to rectangular. You can change that to be golden ratio. We can change it to be the spiral that people quite like now. But to me, the threes sort of work. So if you switch to rectangular, you can choose how many divisions are in the long edge and how many are in the short edge. So at this point, it's 3 by 3, which means whenever I'm cropping, I can move that along, and that's the grid that's going to show. So the grid comes on automatically when I crop, and it's led and controlled by the setting in here under your lens tab. So with that one set, that looks pretty good. So already we're feeling closer into the subject on that picture. And let's go back into our exposure tab now and look at what we're going to do. So we want to bring out a lot of the detail in here. We want to bring up some of the shadows maybe. So as I move my mouse around, you can see the cursor here, and you can see this orange line up here on the histogram. So as I move the cursor around the image, that's going to reflect in the histogram up on the top left. And as I move it around here, that's telling me that this part of this bird is way, way down in the darkest parts of the shadows and probably within the blacks territory. So if I were to pull up shadows, it's going to pull up a lot of detail. I don't really want that. But what I do want is to pull up those blacks there. So that's the lowest part of the shadows, probably the bottom 4 or 5% or so on. And that's what we pull up as a result of pulling up that black slider. What that gives us is all of this detail back here in this bird that we didn't have before. So if I just temporarily turn that off, and there, we've got all the detail back. However, whatever happens whenever you're doing HDR, so you're pulling up blacks and shadows, or you're pulling down whites and highlights, the effect is you're losing contrast. So in this case, I'm happy to lose contrast. I'm okay with losing contrast because I want to see the detail in the bird. But be really careful, because if you lose too much contrast, so let's do it. Let's pull up our blacks, pull up the shadows, pull down the whites, pull down the highlights. We end up with that flat, awful, cartoony sort of image. So we don't want that. We want to pull up enough detail in the black so we can see the individual parts of the feathers and so on in the bird, but not so much that we lose all of that dark contrast that's making this really stand out. Okay, and then we've got a decision to make. So ironically, where I said earlier about having the background too bright and feeling a little bit lacking in detail, we could make these birds stand out by making them the lightest part of the image or the darkest part of the image. And both are completely viable. So let's start with a gradient curve. So if I choose the gradient here on the left-hand side, the first gradient, remember, the first time I draw a mask, it's going to pull down and create a new adjustment layer for me. From this point onwards, any other gradients that I draw on the same layer, it's going to overwrite. You can only have one gradient on each layer at the moment. So as it stands, what that means is when I start drawing another gradient, it's going to replace this top one with that. If I want another gradient, I have to create a new, either empty or filled adjustment layer, but in this case empty, and then draw my new gradient. So now I've got one layer with the bottom gradient and one layer with the top gradient, which are independent. And I'm going to call these by double clicking, bottom and top. Nice and obvious. Okay. If I want to edit that, obviously we can just pull that down. Okay. So again, reminder, gradients, anything that's solid red or beyond this line is 100% affected. Anything that is in the middle is 50% affected, and anything that's down here is 0% affected. And the tighter those lines are together, the closer they become, the more rapid the fall off between the top part and the bottom. So in this case, I'm going to turn the mask off, so press M on your keyboard for mask on and mask off. If you want the mask to automatically appear when you're drawing, then select this option, which doesn't have a keyboard shortcut as default, which is only display the mask when you're drawing. So what that means is when I start drawing a mask, it appears. When I stop, it'll disappear and you can carry on. So in this case, I've got my top part. Now let's imagine we're going to make the birds brighter, the brightest part of the image. So I'm going to go back to my background. I'm going to pull brightness up, because I want these birds to be the brightest part. So I'm setting my base level around them. Then I go into the top gradient, and now I'm going to pull either brightness or exposure down. In this case, I'm going to try exposure. Maybe brightness might be a bit better. The difference, we've done, there's one of our pro tips videos talks about the difference between exposure and brightness. In a nutshell, exposure takes your histogram and it shifts it right or left. So it moves the entire histogram to the right or the entire histogram to the left. Brightness squishes. So instead of pushing stuff off the end and into the shadows or into the overexposed highlights, it actually squishes the darker parts up towards the highlights in the case of increasing it, or squishes the brighter parts down towards the shadows in the case of decreasing it. So it's a much more subtle effect, but it also has the effect of losing contrast again, so just bear that in mind. So in this case, let's just stick with exposure for now. That's fine. Same with bottom. So I'm going to just pull that exposure down there. And that actually looks pretty good. I'm pretty happy with that. I'm going to go back to my background layer. And actually, no, we're not. We're going to create a new empty layer. And I'm going to choose my brush tool. So press B on the keyboard or start brushing. And I'm going to choose a maybe 30% opacity, a nice soft brush, great. And I'm going to start drawing, not too worried because of what I'm going to do here. I'm just going to pick on these birds here, go over them a couple of times. And the reason I'm going over them is because each brush stroke is only giving me a 33% lay down of a mask. If I switch to a grayscale mask, you can see what I'm effectively doing. So I'm just building up layers and layers and layers where it's brightest over the birds themselves. Pretty rough, don't worry about it. The reason is because we're not doing anything like exposure, which you'd see that mask outline. We're going to make a clarity change. So the clarity is just going to give those birds a little bit more pop. The areas of the birds are just going to pop a bit more, especially where they're sat in those midtones. If I want to use structure over the bird, so I'm being unfair here, I'm zooming in quite a bit to 300%, but structure will bring out that feather detail, but it will also bring out noise. So you can see that down here, hopefully on your screens. The noise issue comes from the fact that actually structure is looking for any texture or detail, and it's trying to bring it or make it more prominent. It's trying to bring it up to the forefront of the viewer. That includes noise. So of course in here we pulled up those shadows to make the feathers more visible. Well, when you pull up shadows, the risk is you also pull up noise. So when you pull up noise and then you add some structure, the risk is that the noise becomes more pronounced. So in this case, I'm going to use a bit of structure, but not too much, just to make those birds pop a little bit. So let's just go without and with. You can see it's just a little bit sharper, just a little more punchy. Okay, so that's our, let's call that bird clarity layer. Okay, that looks pretty good there. Okay, so that's one version of the edit. I'm going to right click on the edit and go to clone variant. And this gives me the same picture. So if I do a before and after, there's our before. Let me just change it to a slider so you can see a bit easier. There's our before, there's our after. Okay. But in this case, I'm just going to change it. So instead of making the top and bottom darker, we're going to make the top and bottom lighter, which has the same effect of separating out the bird. So let's pull up the bottom and let's pull up the top. And we almost get back to that same feeling of before, just with the birds a little bit clearer, a little bit cleaner in the shot. And again, before and after. So the effect of using linear response means that we've got these two options without having to recover too much. But if we look at the birds themselves, in the auto version, they're very high contrast, which may be the style that you're looking for. It may be the view that you had of the picture. And again, all of this stuff is subjective. So this is my view rather than necessarily the right view. But in this case here, we lose a lot of the detail because of that really harsh contrast, the dark blacks versus the bright white of the water behind. We have the same overall effect in this version by brightening the top and the bottom, but we've got all this detail back in the birds themselves. Let me just go into 100% so you can see here. So we've got all of this stuff back rather than where it's kind of lost here a little bit. And of course, because it's done on a layer, we can change the amount. So let's go back to our bird clarity layer. I can actually reduce the clarity by changing the opacity of that layer up here, or I can go to my background layer and we can reduce the brightness overall. So we've got all of those different options, whereas on the original base image, we're stuck with a high contrast image to start with, and we almost end up in recovery mode first. So, summary, I guess. Let's just go out. So that's with the darker parts at the top, that's with the lighter parts at the top and bottom as well. Overall, if you're faced with an image which starts out with some really harsh, high contrast, highlights and shadows and stuff like that, and you think, oh, the first thing I'm going to have to do is pull in all those HDR sliders. Remember that when you pull in HDR sliders, you lose contrast, and you're already starting in recovery mode rather than starting in editing mode. So as a hint, generally, try out, under the base characteristics tool, that curve of linear response. It can help in some cases. And all it's doing is effectively flattening out that curve. It's getting rid of that almost S shape in the curve that Capture One likes to put in as auto. And it allows you then to tweak to a much greater control level than what you would have normally, in a way that then we can get back to the auto version if you really wanted to, but you don't have to do so much recovery to get to a place where you've got all that detail and all that lovely texture and everything that's in the softer shades and tones. Okay. Let's switch to another one, but in fact, let me try and remember a second. there was something in here, I think, under description. Can't remember which picture it was. We're going to go through some of these in a second. But I want to show you guys a little bit of a hint or a tip. Because someone, or a couple of people actually, have been asking me for quite a while about keywords and tags and catalog management and so on. I'm just trying to find the picture that I was referring to. Oh, there we go. That'll do. Okay. So this shot is from Warren. Let's just move that up here so I don't get confused. Okay, this shot's from Warren. And in our EXIF data, so when it was imported, in here we've got the description, tidal streams leading to China, Poop Peak. Okay, where does that come from? Well, it comes from our import dialog box. So the reason I'm going to cover this quickly is a lot of people are absolutely confused and stuck on how tagging and keywording and so on works when you're searching through a catalog. And they'll often say to me, okay, so how do you do the tags and the keywords? So if I go to our keywords section down here, I can put in China, for example, and that ends in there. I can put in wedding. I can put in girl, I can put in boy, I can put in tree, and they all go in as tags. And then the theory goes that I can then search for those tags, especially up here in the catalog. So I can go to my search tool and type in wedding, and up would come this picture, for example. But those tags can really get confusing. A, you end up with a lot of them. And B, let me just remove these tags very quickly. B, if I type in tree or trees or China, Chinese, blah blah blah, all of those different things, they become different tags. They become different tags in their own right. I don't use tags, just as a bit of an admission. The reason is because I use the description field, and the description field comes when you import into a catalog. So if I click on import, let's go into here. There's a random thing here. So these are a couple of images randomly of a lighthouse that we used a couple of weeks ago. I'm just going to pick on these images here just to show you. So I'm going to leave them in current location. Copyright, we'd put in your name, probably website, blah, blah, blah. Description. Lighthouse, Dorset, UK, sunrise, cold, clouds, frame averaging. Okay, when I import these images, let me just go into our folder and go to our recent import. There. In our EXIF data, which is found under this I tab on here, you're going to see that description comes in. You're also going to see the copyright notice that we typed in there, but it's the description that's important to me, because if I now go to all images in this entire catalog, and I go to my search box up here and type in lighthouse, all my lighthouse images come up. But equally, if I type in, like that version from Warren, China, there's Warren's China image. Now, I haven't tagged that image. It just came from the fact that Capture One has searched through the EXIF data, and it's found in this image the word China. So don't get me wrong, if you've got hours and hours and hours after every single shoot, or if you're doing a lot of, for instance, e-commerce stuff or product photography and whatever, tags can be really helpful. Keywords can be really helpful to organize things in a much cleaner way than I do. But if you don't have time for that and you just want the ability to search for things, just make sure that when you import, just make sure you've got some content in this description. Use it like a keyword field if you want to, and just put in all the keywords that are relevant to that shoot. So the country, the type of shoot, whether it was summer, winter, or whatever, which means that when you search in Capture One using that quick little search box up here, it's going to search through everything within that catalog, and it's going to find it if it's got that keyword in the description field. So anyway, it's a quicker way, in my view, of being able to find the exact picture that I want. I've always done it that way. I have seen people that do it very successfully with keywords, but to me, the upkeep and the management and the admin of all those keywords, when I just want to find a picture of New Zealand ice mountain, I can do that with description and that little search box. I don't have to worry about keywording every single picture that I put in. What it does rely on is when you do import. So for example, on this one, when we import, we only import the images that are relevant to that description at the same time. So let's imagine these ones were sunrise. We'd import them with the word sunrise in there. Then we'd come out and we'd go back to re-import the next one. So for instance, there, down to there, and we put sunset in them, for example. Exactly the same with keywords. It's just going to save me a hell of the time. So there we go. That's probably not best practice according to the world, but that's how I do things, and I find it's a lot quicker. Okay, so let's go. Oops, I just imported all of those into Warren's albums. Let's just get rid of those. Okay, right. So let's start with this shot, actually, from Warren. So let's just make sure we're on the right place. So in this case, we've got the lens profile loaded in. It's a Sony 2470. We're at f8. We probably don't have much diffraction, but in this case, it's probably not going to do any harm to turn that on. And again, good example of, let's just have a look at our base characteristics and look at what these curves are going to do. So let's leave it on auto for now, and I'll show you another way you can come back to the base characteristics later. So in terms of lens profile, distortion at 24mm, there might be a little bit, but frankly, it's a huge landscape, so I'm not too worried about it. Oop, sorry, I missed some questions. Let's just cover them. So would imported EXIF data, use photomechanic for importing and captioning, be treated differently, the EXIF data directly added? No, it's not treated differently, David. As long as, the one thing to be careful though, actually, just bear in mind, if your detail coming from something like photomechanic includes the description field, if I type something into the description field here in the metadata in Capture One, when I import it, it's going to overwrite. So what you need to do is just make sure that that's blank. If it's blank, it won't overwrite, and it will take the description that you have into those fields. If it's got content in, it's going to overwrite it into this IPTC content in the description there. There is one little annoyance that it is an annoyance in my world that I have. If you shoot with a phase 1 camera and you've used frame averaging, or you've used dual exposure, oh no, not dual exposure plus, dual exposure plus, sorry, it's only frame averaging. The frame averaging information is put into the description. So I lose the time that I was exposing for because I overwrite it with the description, but hopefully that'll change at some point, and it'll go back up to our firmware information up here, just like dual exposure does. But generally speaking, if the description field is empty on your import in here, then whatever is in the EXIF data for that file will come across into Capture One as well, just as normal. Okay, where were we? So lens stuff here, right? Pretty good on that. Sharpness fall off, I'm pretty sure on this lens it's okay. Yeah, we've got a little bit of softness out there, so let's just pull that in a little bit there. And I'm not too worried about any light fall off because we may end up vignetting this anyway a little bit later on. So let's skip past our base characteristics, even though I've just shown you it on the other picture, and go straight into our exposure tab. The reason is I need to see what's in this picture first, really, before we start really playing with anything. Oh, here we go. Oh, Mr. Grover's online. Hello, Mr. Grover. So he's just said, also, the default photomechanic is use XMP Sidecar files. You can override. Yes. Oh, yeah, actually, that's a fair point. So if you want it to be embedded in the file, you need to tell photomechanic that you're putting it in there. But then you've got to tell, if you're going to leave it in the Sidecar file, you've got to tell Capture One to load in the Sidecar information, which is under... Just pull that up here. So at the moment, mine, for example, is set to auto sync Sidecar none, because I don't use Sidecar files. If you do, then you need to make sure it's in there as full sync. But yeah, so as long as you're bringing it in and you've told Capture One to bring it in, then no worries either way. But now Mr. Grover's online, we need to talk about keywords, because keywords are very important. They're the best way to organize your catalog. It's just I don't do it. Okay, so in this scene with the landscape, let's have a look at bringing up the detail. So we can bring up the detail in two ways. We can pull our exposure up. In fact, for some reason, this one was way down. I know why it's way down. It's because we need to see what was up there. So here's our exposure at 0. That's why I was a little bit confused. Let's go back then to our base characteristics and change that curve from auto to linear response. And we can see immediately what Capture One's done with the auto curve is it's added lots of contrast, which is great, and it means that the image looks nice and vibrant and bright. But look at all the detail that we've lost. Whereas if I'd started with linear response, we've got all that detail and that subtlety back. So to me, and again, please don't get me wrong, 80% of the time I use the auto curve. In fact, probably more than that, maybe 90% of the time. Especially with city stuff, what I tend to find is if you start with linear response, the image starts pretty flat, and then you end up spending all of your time getting it back to what the auto curve would have done in the first place. So I personally would stick to auto unless you have to do anything different. But in this case, let's look at it. So auto is leaving a lot of stuff washed out up there. If I go to my exposure tab and bring the exposure down, well, okay, by bringing it down, we've got a lot of the detail back, but we've also lost a lot of it into the shadows. Whereas, if I had switched that to linear response, I don't have to pull the exposure down by as much to get all that detail back. So it's a little more nuanced, a little more subtle. I've got lots of detail now, lots of smooth tones, without having to pull down those highlights from where the auto curve put them in the first place. So from that perspective, assess the picture that you're looking at and decide the right curve. As I say, in 80-90% of cases, auto curves are going to be perfectly fine. But if you've got an image which is particularly high contrast and you're struggling and you think the first thing I'm going to have to do is recover all my shadows and my highlights and whatever, try the linear response curve first, see what result you get from that, and then start playing. Okay, so leaving it on the linear response, which why not in this case, let's just see what's actually in those highlights. So let's pull the highlights down. Well, actually, there's not a lot of information in there. And the reason there's not a lot of information is because it was pretty much overexposed to start with. We don't have an exposure warning, which tells me actually it's not a case of overexposed. It's just there's no detail in there. It's probably a foggy and cloudy day. So up here, even though it's pretty bright, it's not actually up beyond 255, even when it's reset back to 0. It's nearly there. It's at 232, 231, just reading those numbers up there. But it's not actually overexposed. It's just a flat sky. So let's pull this exposure back down a little bit, look at the whole scene, and then I've got to decide whether I want all of this foreground or not. And to me, the first thing that's distracting is the angle. We're slightly out. So let's just pull that horizon line across with our straighten tool, which is the one up here. And that's just going to rotate things a little bit more. Straighten, remember, is different to keystone. Keystone corrects for perspective distortion, whereas straighten just corrects the horizon. So in this case, we're now nice and straight according to that. And I'm just going to change the crop, actually. So at the moment, the crop, I think, is a 2:3 crop. I'm going to change this to a 1:2 crop. So we're going to go quite a lot more panoramic than the original shot was intended to be. But what this means is I can pull a nice lead in from this corner down here with this river. In fact, we could even go a little bit lower if we wanted to, but I'm going to leave that there. Okay, that just feels a little more cinematic or a little more panoramic, more of a statement thing. So always with these things, think about how it's going to look on a wall. And just that change alone has made quite a big dramatic difference in this. Now in here, we've got lots and lots of data in the mid-tones and in the lower shadows down here. We can use our clarity tool to really make that pop. So let's just do that on the background. I'm not even going to bother with a layer. And let's just pull that up to about there. Good. And now we can start to play with levels and curves. So remember, levels and curves allow us to stretch the histogram. So I'm telling with levels, I'm saying to Capture One, yeah, okay, that's fine. 255 is your white, or your brightest part of the image. I want you to pretend actually that it's going to be 210 is the equivalent of the brightest part of the image. So I'm going to pull this little slider down here, down to, like I just said, let's say 210. Wasn't a bad guess. And we're pulling up that histogram. So if you look at the effect that it has on the histogram up here, the levels histogram, remember, will always reflect the original histogram. Whereas if I look at the top histogram here and temporarily undo, you'll see what we've done. So we've shifted that top part of the histogram up. So we're now saying the bits that were almost bright are now really bright. And then we can do the same with the shadows. So we can say, actually, even though you're not quite in the darkest parts of the shadows, we're going to pull you up so that you become darker still. Now be careful when you do this that you don't clip stuff, so that you don't clip anything way overexposed or way underexposed as a result of pulling those sliders and levels too close into the data. You really don't want to be passing across the lines of where the data starts in that the histogram on that chart. Question from Simon. On the subject of base characteristics and linear response, do picture styles have an impact on the raw file given that it affects the embedded JPEG? So it affects the JPEG. Yes, it doesn't affect the raw. We covered this about, I think, 2 or 3 sessions ago. I think from memory it was Trish's picture. And it was a Fuji file that came across. And actually, the Fuji files are fantastic because they come across with the film styles. So when you load it in, the film style you selected is going to load in for that picture here under your base characteristics. and be really careful, because what a lot of people don't realize is you can of course change that back to auto, or you can change it back to another film style. So when it loads in, it will load in the exact film style that you selected in the camera. The JPEG version of that picture is stuck with it. Nothing you can do. But the raw file, you can go back in and you can change that film style to whatever one you want instead. So yes, it does come across. The JPEG, you're fixed with it, but the raw file, you can always go back into base characteristics and change it later as well. Okay, so on here, got some nice tones in here. I don't really want to change too much of it. I think actually the brighter part of the shot at the top is quite important to keep. Let me show you why. If I put in a gradient up here, which we typically do, and I pull that exposure down, it's just going to look a little bit murky, a little bit dark and sinister. So I don't want to really change that there. I might maybe want to try and see if we've got any more texture and clarity and structure, but I don't think we do. It's pretty flat up there. So we'll leave that as it is. I mean, there's a little bit of cloud hint up here if we have a look. So this little gray line here, which wasn't there too strongly before, but I think that's more of a curve change than anything else. We've got what looks like maybe a hair on the lens. So for this one, let's just choose our healing tool. So up here, we've got the little sticky plaster one. Again, just like a gradient tool, when I choose the healing brush, it's going to automatically create a new healing layer before I do anything else. If I've already got a healing layer on the list of layers here on the left-hand side, it's going to automatically do the heal on the top healing layer that I have. So if I've got 3 healing layers, it's going to automatically go to healing layer, or the healing layer number 1, or the one at the top, and do more healing on that layer. If I don't have any, as you can see, it's just going to create a new heal layer 1, and it's going to apply that to that layer. And it's guessed pretty well where we want to copy from, just to get rid of that hair. We might need a little bit of blending in. That looks pretty good. Okay, so that's a bit better. And then leading up to here, what I would be tempted to do is actually to put in a small gradient at the bottom. Now with gradients, if you're getting a little bit wonky with the angles, hold down the shift key on your keyboard and it'll automatically revert to 45-degree increments. So you've got to push the mouse around and it will stick with 45 degrees or straight up if you leave it straight. So there's our mask here for our gradient that's there. And let's pull down our exposure here, so we're leading up into this scene. Now, some people might choose to do a round vignette with this, just to pull it up to that mountain. Personally, I don't think it needs it. I think it's actually a bit better left a little bit purer than that. And that, to me, would probably be it. Any bringing back of highlights is just going to change that white to be grey. Nothing much is going to be gained from doing that. Pulling up the shadows, again, all we're doing is losing contrast, and the contrast helps create mood. So to me, we go from there to here, much better. But it's all about the feel of this picture, because if I create a clone and completely reset, it goes from this to that. And that feels like a print that I'd put on a wall. This needs some work before it gets there. So again, we've done this in a couple of sessions before as well. But think about crop, think about the composition before you start playing too much with some of the edits later on, because it may change your mind in how you edit things. Okay, let's just hop on to here. This one from Dave, it's loaded in our lens profile. We're at F5, weird third of a stop. Let's just have a look how close we are in at 100%. Okay, it's pretty sharp. I don't want to over sharpen this, but I do probably want to come out a little bit in terms of our crop and focus maybe on here rather than down here. So again, it's going to be another one of those days where we do a lot of 2x1 crops. Before you crop, make sure the image is straight. And on here, we've got roughly a horizon, or certainly a horizon that people would use with their eyes to make sure. So again, even though it's a small change, it's only maybe a degree or two, it is important before you start cropping, make sure the image is straight. Otherwise, it's going to go all types of wrong before you even start. And this, what looks like a whale here. So that's going to be our focus. So let's put him roughly on the third line down there. So what we want to do is make sure we're not chopping any mountains unnecessarily out of there, like that. And again, there. It's just the feel of the picture. It just feels more cinematic. It feels more panoramic, more landscapey, more like a print that I'd want to put on a wall. Okay, so with this little beauty in here. Again, this is a pretty wide lens for this sort of shot. Even though it's at 70 millimeters, you're not going to get a huge amount of detail in here. Let's have a look, just for fun. This is on the auto curve. What would linear response do? Okay, it's going to flatten it too much. So again, this is a perfect example of one where I would leave it with auto to start with, and we'll start from there. With the Nikon file, we've also got a portrait curve that's come in, but I would actually just leave it on auto as you start with that for this particular shot. Okay, the exposure tab, which is where we are. And we've got to decide whether we want these mountains to come out a little bit more or to stay in the background and kind of washed out. I'm tempted to make a bit more of a feature of them because there's this big glacier here, which is obviously quite prominent, but if you don't see it in enough detail, you're going to lose it. So let's put in a new layer, just have it. I could have just created the new gradient, but in this case, I'm just going to draw a gradient with quite a hard fall off. So remember I talked about the distance between those lines. The bigger the line distance, the more of a fall off you get. The softer the fall off, the closer the lines, the tighter that fall off becomes. And with this, we're just going to, in fact, let me just do it from there down to there. And with that background, I'm going to pull up some clarity. Quite a bit, in fact. We're going to get up to the 50s, which is quite unusual. But all that's doing is it's giving us a bit more presence with these mountains. Now, on top of that, we could use our curves, because look at this histogram. That point in the middle, this pyramid shape of a histogram, typically tells us there's not a lot of contrast going on. And when there's not a lot of contrast, that's fine if it's intentional, but if you're trying to get the detail of the image, we want to be able to stretch that out. How do we stretch out a histogram? Well, we use our levels or our curves. So in this case, actually, I might even go into our curves. So rather than just doing a blunt tool of pulling up some highlights and pulling down some shadows, we're going to do it a little more carefully and adjust where all of the detail is. Because I don't really want to push those highlights any brighter, and I don't really want any of the shadows to disappear. So we're going to take these shadows on this side of the curve of the histogram down, and these highlights on this side of the histogram up. But I'm going to leave, here's the clever bit with the curve, these highlights here, which were the brightest parts, exactly where they were. So I don't want, so if you imagine this diagonal line is as is, so no change. By doing this, it means that I can control individual parts of that histogram and say, actually, you upper midtones, I want to be brighter. You lower midtones, I want to be darker. But you absolute shadows, leave you where you are. And you, the top 1/4 of my highlights, don't change those either. And if I do before and after quickly, so there's without, and there's with that curve change, that's pretty dramatic. And that's really brought those mountains up to the forefront. Okay, so with that done, we could lead into the whale a little bit. And the way we're going to do that is obviously a nice little gradient leading up to him or her. Let's do that. In fact, I'm going to pull that down a bit because we want it to finish, remember, before it gets to the whale. And with that, we're just going to pull down our exposure just a touch. Don't want it too much. What we don't want is this effect. It looks horrible. So it's got to be subtle, but it's a way of just subtly pushing the viewer's gaze up to the central part here. If we really, really want to, we could go to our background and just pull the whole vignette in, but you're going to get that weird sort of rounding effect around it, which almost, in this case, it might work. It sort of looks like you're looking through a periscope, but in general terms, it makes images look quite dated by having too much of a vignette. So to me, I'd leave it as it is. We might pop the clarity in the overall scene up a little touch. And that's probably it. If I start playing with blues and things like that, then we're gonna really struggle because everything's just going to change that shade because it's very muted to start with. But let's just go to before and after. So there's our before, and there's our after. So all that detail back in those backgrounds, and this just makes it feel like those things are imposing on this scene rather than in here they're sort of fading off into the distance. And again, a lot of this again comes down to crop. So if I completely reset this version, there's our original, there's our raw. Oh, sorry, there's our new version with the crop. There's our raw. This feels like something that would go on a wall. This one, again, just needs a little bit of work to look at it. Hue, why do the curve on the gradient layer? Simply because I only wanted to affect, let me just turn it on, the top part here. I didn't want to affect the bottom part here with the curve. I want this water to stay relatively lacking in detail. If anything, actually, we could have a little bit of fun here. What we could do is create a new, been very bad and not labeled these, let's call it unclarity. What we could do is use another gradient curve here, and just like with clarity makes things sharper, well, we can reduce the clarity as well in this foreground. Again, just to push that viewer's gaze up to whale and the ships with the icebergs. So let's just go. So yeah, there we go. Before, through to after. A lot more pronounced, a lot more poppy, a lot more vivid, and a lot more exciting just by making that slight curve adjustment. And it looks, the curve tool scares people. It looks complicated. Just remember that diagonal line is the status quo. That's as is right now. And then you're looking at the histogram and you're picking on certain points of the histogram and saying, these tones I want to be brighter, these tones I want to be darker, these tones brighter and these tones darker. It doesn't make sense to do a standard, just normal S-curve if all of my data, like in this one, is in a tiny proportion of the histogram. I've got to do the S-curve within that histogram to get the best out of it. Yeah, Ralph, name your layers or you forget what they're used for. Exactly. I was just being a bit sloppy on that one. So yes, always name your layers when you create them. Otherwise, when you come back to them a couple of weeks later, you'll forget exactly what you put it in for. Okay, we'll probably finish up on this one. This is a shot from Igor. So this was, let me just load it up here, a Fuji Xe2. Okay, so the Fuji camera was built in, so the manufacturer profile comes across from the camera. So that's different to generic. Manufacturer profile means that Capture One is reading in the data from the camera and applying that to the image. So again, we can do chromatic aberration just like normal. We can do the analyze on this particular shot. F1? Are we sure? Or is that just a bad read? I think that might be a bad readout from that lens, or maybe, I'm not sure. I'm not familiar with that lens, but okay, if it says F1, we'll go with it. But in this case, let's just look and see if we've got any issues out here. Maybe diffraction correction might help us a little bit. There's not much in the way of light fall off, but here we go. We're pretty good. Okay, so with this one, let's go into our curve. And again, I wouldn't normally, I'm just showing you again just to sort of repeat. So linear response is going to give us a flatter image, muted tones, but a lot more scope to be able to change things. Whereas auto is going to start off in a much more vivid way, a much more vibrant way. And in this case, it works a lot better. So I'm going to stick with the auto curve. We're going to go in, and again, it's a weird one, but I'm tempted to just make a small change to that crop. And again, at 1:2. I seem to be loving 1:2 at the moment. But you'll see why in a second. These birds up here, they're interesting, but they're not useful to the shot, whereas maybe this one here on its own is. Getting the straightening tool on here is a little bit of a challenge because I don't actually have a horizon. This is a river that's obviously going away from us, so it's designed to be at an angle because of perspective. If I draw a line across here, it's going to twist this and it's going to be wrong. I'm relying on the fact that this boat is level. That looks pretty good. There we go. Okay, it's an old Helios lens. So it's either f8 or f5.6. I thought we'd found an f1 lens. That was pretty cool for a second, but no. Okay, so with that crop, let me just apply that crop. Okay, do you see the difference? So let me just create again another clone and just reset. So from there to there. Some people will prefer this. It's got a lot more space, a lot more openness. To me, this part down the bottom isn't adding much. These birds, even though they're captured in it, that one there is kind of cool, but these don't mean so much. So to me, I'd be tempted to pull it in, maybe even a little bit higher there. You could get that bird in. We can clone him out if we don't want him. Completely up to us. But there we go. White balance is looking pretty good. We can choose to make this a bit cooler and a bit pinker if we want, or maybe even towards sunset, so we can go into there. So again, making it feel how you remember. I wasn't there at that time. That feels about right to me. We've still got blue water. One thing as a quick tip, if you get into a bit of a muddle with white balance, especially when water's involved, if the water started out blue and you change your white balance to make the water look green or yellow or something like that, you've probably gone too far. So use the water as a baseline. If it started out blue, it should probably remain blue, and then you're tweaking around the edges. Now, of course, just like before, we can leave that and we can create a new gradient up here on the top. and we can have a different white balance on the top part of the image. So if we want to warm up that sky and we want to increase some tint in the sky, we can without affecting the bottom. Don't make the difference too great. If you make the difference too great, it's going to look fake and it looks just wrong, because how can I possibly have a volcano or volcanic ash red sky with cool blue or green water down below? It doesn't make sense. But in this case, actually, we can get away with it a little bit, just to tweak it so it's a little bit more sunsetty and a little more vibrant at the top, while keeping the tones of that water down below. Okay, with this, I mean, we've got the trees here. We could make them stand out a little bit more. The tool we're going to use to do that is, and let's just go back to our point. Let's label our layers. I'm going to call this layer trees. I'm going to use a brush tool, or B on the keyboard, and let's just make that a little bit bigger and a little bit more opaque. And I'm just going to draw roughly over the trees. Because I don't have my mask set to show while drawing, you're not going to see the mask until I press the M button, so bear that in mind. If I have it set to only display when drawing, when I'm off, the mask disappears. When I'm on, the mask reappears, ready for me to draw. Kind of handy. That'll do there, pretty good. And again, if I start drawing, up it comes again. Keeps appearing, cool. But the second, just bear in mind, the second I press the M key, I've now overridden it. I can now only have on or off. I have to go back into here and say only display when drawing to turn it on again, unless you set a shortcut key to do that. But with these trees, let's just zoom in a little bit to see the trees in a bit more detail. With that mask set, I'm going to increase the clarity here in the trees. We're going to pull up the shadows a touch, but also increase our contrast a little. So again, it's just a subtle change, but it's pulling out detail on the tree. Now, this is one that's come up in the Facebook group a couple of times, the halo effect. So you see where I've made that mask, and you see where I've done this clarity change. Look at this boundary here above the trees. So let me just turn that layer off and on. So we've made the trees a little bit more interesting here, but we've also ended up with this halo over the top. That's what you've got to avoid. It's a telltale sign that you've done too much clarity, but the quick way to get rid of it around this sort of image is if I turn our mask on and go back to our tree mask, all I'm going to do is just erase around the trees. And the reason is because I can get away with it here. It doesn't matter if that clarity bump goes all the way to the edges of the trees. It does matter if the clarity bump goes over the edge of the trees, because then I get that horrible halo effect, and it's a telltale that you've edited it way too much if you do that. So try and keep any mask for clarity within the area that you're trying to edit and not outside of it. Otherwise, you're going to get that halo bump happen to you as well. We could pull up the saturation a little bit now. That's looking okay. Okay, so now with our overall image, I'm just going to create a new filled adjustment layer. So, and I'm going to affect everything down below. So all of those changes of the trees and the sky, we're going to affect equally. This is a fully masked layer. And let's go, ooh, sorry, question. JD, why wouldn't you use the lighthouse as a reference to straighten the image? We can. What you're going to find is it's probably actually pretty straight. Let's just pull a guide on. Let's just have a, move you around a little bit. Let's just have a little look at our guide. And it's pretty much smack bang down the center. So the issue here, JD, is it's less about the fact that it's not straight. It's the fact that it's actually keystoning here that we can see. It's the fact that the distance goes away from us, so it seems to go up the frame as a result. We could fix it with the keystone tool, but my worry is you're going to lose too much. Let's just show you very quickly. So we know it's straight because we've got that stack, and you rightly say, yeah, you absolutely could use that. The stack, I think it's a smokestack or something. You could use that as a way of making sure the image is straight. You don't have to use the straighten tool horizontally. You can use it vertically as well. But if I use the keystone tool and try and match this line of the river along here, let's just apply that. You see it's now going to stretch that part of this over here, that part of the river. It's going to pull that towards us. It's going to push that part away from us, and maybe that's a bit better. Maybe it's the right call to use the keystone tool on this, simply because it sort of evens up that feel of the image. What you do have now is this boat feeling like it's leaning a little bit down to the bottom right. Not sure which one is better to do, but you know, for sure we can tweak it so it's a little bit better than the standard one, just to make that less of a lean as it goes away from us in the scene. Okay, Pablo just asked, where are we? Here, sorry, add a luma range. Would a luma range work here? Yes, it would. So on the trees, if I didn't want to do that rubbing out around the outside, I could pick on a luma range, of course. The luma range is going to select only the darkest parts of the trees. The challenge you have with a luma range on this particular type of image is you're going to spend a lot of time refining the edge, and you still risk having some of those halo effects if you don't get the edging quite right between the dark areas and the light areas. So in this case here with the trees, I'm not too worried about losing some of that clarity effect and some of that structure effect as it gets towards the edge of the trees. No one's going to notice that fall off. It just allows us to be very quick in terms of boosting the middle. Okay, so again, there we go. Before and after. It's a very subtle change on this one. What's the bigger change is from here to here. This one feels again like a panoramic print. This one, we just need to do a little bit of crop and tweaking to get it right. Okay, cool. What have we got? One question, Andrea. I saw your images on the website. They look very saturated. It depends on the scene, Andrea. So typically speaking, if we're doing a sunrise or a sunset shot and we've got amazing color in the sky, we want to use that amazing color in the sky. But by example, there are some places, got a random news thing come up. There are some places that we go to where it's taken us 5 or 6 attempts to get even a hint of color in the sky and so on. Where there is color, we'll use it. Where there isn't, if you try and add in a huge amount of color that was never there, it's just going to look obvious. For cities, especially at night, cities feel more energetic if they've got a bit more saturation, and we tend to use a bit of a boost on it. So again, it depends on the scene. It completely depends on the scene. It depends on the feel that you're going for. We produce some that are completely subtle and muted, some that are very, very vibrant and electric, and everything in between. It just depends on how you read the image. Okay, so that's us for today. Remember, so next session we will do is I think the 27th, which I think is next Monday. So same time next Monday. There is, remember, that Facebook group. So if you want to continue this conversation, then head across to Facebook. So the Poor Evil Live group, we'll put this video up onto there so we can have a chat about it later on. Remember, there are those pro tips things. So we've got stuff on clarity, on brightness, on exposure, on before and after tools and whatever. You can download those for free or view them for free. And if you want to get your image looked at on screen next Monday, then make sure you go onto the upload tool. So poorevillive.wetransfer.com. Put what you want up there with any questions or challenges you've got, and we'll try and pick it up on the next session. In the meantime, stay well, everyone, and I'll catch you next week. Cheers. Bye.